The air at the Henderson County Implement Auction tasted of diesel fumes, rust, and the cheap sweet tobacco from old men's pipes. It was the fall of 1969, and the harvest was mostly in. The mood was optimistic, prices were steady, and the talk was all about horsepower and expansion. I was there for the same reason I went to most auctions, to pick through the boneyard of forgotten iron, looking for a spare water pump for my 4020 or a set of used cultivators I could get for pennies on the dollar. I never went for the main event. The main event that day was a brand new cherry red International Harvester 1066, sitting on a flatbed trailer like a king on its throne. The paint shone so bright it hurt the eyes. The tires still had the little rubber nubs on them, and the black and white cab with its promise of air conditioning was a thing of futuristic beauty. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Hemphill, whose voice could cut through the roar of a straight-piped diesel, was working the crowd into a frenzy. "Look at her, boys. 130 horse of pure American muscle, turbocharged. This ain't your daddy's farm all, I'll tell you that. Who'll start the bidding at $10,000? A murmur went through the crowd of denim-clad farmers. 10,000 was real money. That was land money. But the bids came, slow at first, then faster, as two old-timers who'd had a good year on soybeans went back and forth. Then a new voice cut through the chatter, clear and confident. 12.5. Every head turned. It was Clayton Vance. He was leaning against the fender of his new Ford pickup, arms crossed, a little smirk playing on his lips. Clay was 10 years my junior, all ambition and polished boots. He'd taken over his father's modest 80 acres a few years back and, with the help of the Farmers National Bank, had already doubled it. He farmed with a line of credit and a swagger that rubbed most of the older generation the wrong way. The two old-timers dropped out. The bidding was now between Clay and a co-op from the next county over. It climbed to 13, then 14,000. Hemphill was sweating, his chant getting faster and faster. 14,000, do I hear 14.5? 14.5 from the co-op. Now 15, can I get 15? Clay didn't even flinch, he just held up two fingers. 16, he said, his voice calm, almost bored. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $16,000 for a tractor. The man from the co-op just shook his head and stepped back. It was over. "Sold," Hemphill screamed, slamming his gavel down on the podium, "to Mr. Clayton Vance for $16,000. Clay pushed himself off the truck and walked toward the auctioneer's table, pulling a checkbook from his jacket. But it wasn't his checkbook. It was the loan officer from the bank, Mr. Abernathy, who stepped forward with a clipboard of papers. They signed them right there on the hood of a dusty Chevy, Clay smiling for a local newspaper photographer who'd shown up. He was making a statement. This was the future. Leverage, debt, progress. As the crowd dispersed, I was looking over a pallet of rusty hydraulic cylinders when Clay walked up, Abernathy trailing him like a proud father. "Jedediah," Clay said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Picking through the scrap heap again? Thought I might see you bidding on that old Case 830. More your speed." I straightened up, wiping my greasy hands on a red rag I kept in my back pocket. "She's a good tractor, the 830. Simple, honest." "Honest don't get the crop in on time, Jed," he scoffed. He gestured with his chin toward his new 1066. "That's what it takes now. Power, speed. You can't farm 300 acres with that old green museum piece of yours." He was talking about my John Deere 4020. My father bought it new in '64, the year before he passed. It was the last major purchase he ever made. It had over 8,000 hours on it. The green paint on the hood was faded to a dull olive, and the seat was cracked and patched with silver duct tape. But every drop of oil, every filter, every wire on that machine I knew by heart, and more importantly, it was mine. The title was in the safe in my father's old desk, free and clear. "That museum piece has fed my family for 5 years without a single payment book," I said, keeping my voice even. "It'll do just fine." Abernathy cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Jed, the bank is always here to help you modernize. We could have you in a new machine by next week. The interest rates are very favorable. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Abernathy, but I'm not looking to modernize my debt." Clay laughed out loud. "You hear that? He's not interested in debt. Jed, the whole world runs on debt. It's how you grow. You're sitting on 200 acres of prime bottom land, paid for, and you're farming it like it's 1940. It's a waste. It's my waste then, I said, turning back to the pallet of parts. Suit yourself, Clay said, his tone shifting from amusement to pity. Don't come crying to me when you're trying to get your corn planted in June with that relic while I'm already cultivating. He and Abernathy walked away, their laughter echoing off the corrugated steel of the auction barn. I stood there for a long moment, the smell of grease and old iron filling my lungs. I looked at the new 1066, a gleaming red monster of potential and obligation. Then I looked at my own hands, calloused and stained from years of working on my own equipment. Before we go any further into this, I have to ask you folks listening a question. Have you ever known a man like that? Maybe it was your father or your grandfather. A man who'd spend a week grinding valves and setting the timing himself rather than sign a loan paper for a new engine. A man who believed that the only thing you truly own is the thing you don't owe any man a dime on. Let me know in the comments below, because it's a breed of man that seems to be fading away, and their story is worth telling. I found a usable cylinder for $5 and went home. The sound of my 4020 firing up was a comfort. It wasn't a roar like that new turbo on the 1066. It was a deep, throaty rumble, the sound of 6 cylinders of dependable paid-for power. The synchro range transmission clunked solidly into gear, a familiar mechanical sound that I trusted. There was no cab, no air conditioning. In the summer, the heat from the engine block would cook your right leg, and in the winter, the wind would cut you to the bone. But I could feel the tractor, feel the pull of the plow in the soil through the soles of my boots. I was connected to it. It was an extension of me, not some sterile machine I was merely leasing from the bank. The next couple of years went by, and the gap between Clay Vance's world and mine grew wider. By 1971, he'd used that big 1066 to farm not only his own ground, but another 200 acres he'd rented from a widow who'd moved to town. His farm was a showcase of modern efficiency. My place, by contrast, looked like a holdout from another era. My fences were straight and my barns were painted, but the equipment sitting in the yard was old. Beside the 4020 sat my father's old Farmall M, which I still used for mowing hay and running the grain auger. My combine was an International 403, a good machine in its day, but ancient compared to the new axial flow models the big operators were buying. The talk at the co-op was always the same. Clay Vance picked up the old Miller place. Heard Clay's putting up 2 new grain bins. And always the unspoken follow-up, wonder how long old Jed Stone can hang on. They weren't mean-spirited, most of them. They were just practical men, and they saw the writing on the wall. Farming was getting bigger, faster, more expensive. My refusal to take on debt was seen as stubborn foolishness, a prideful march toward failure. The breaking point came in the spring of '72. I was in the back 80, trying to get my corn in the ground. The soil was just right, the sun was warm, and I was making good time. The 4020 was pulling the 6-row planter like it was nothing. That diesel engine singing its steady tune. Then, without warning, there was a loud bang, a shudder that ran through the whole frame of the tractor, and a sickening screech of metal on metal. The engine died instantly. I climbed down, my heart sinking into my boots. A black viscous puddle of oil was already spreading on the tilled earth beneath the engine block. I didn't have to be a master mechanic to know what had happened. She'd thrown a rod. A clean, catastrophic failure right through the side of the block. I stood there in the silence of the field, the smell of hot oil sharp in the air. In the distance, on the other side of the fence line, I could hear the high-pitched whine of a turbocharger. It was Clay. He was working the field he'd rented next to mine, his 1066 kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled an 8-row planter at twice my speed. He saw me standing there, saw the dead tractor and the pool of oil. He slowed, drove along the fence line, and stopped. He didn't get out. He just sat there in his air-conditioned cab, looking down at me. He shook his head slowly, a look on his face that was worse than any insult. It was pity. Then he put his tractor in gear and drove on, leaving me alone in the quiet field with my broken machine. Getting the 4020 back to the shop was an ordeal. I had to walk the 2 miles back to the house, get the old Farmall M, and drag the dead John Deere home, chain by heavy chain. It took the rest of the day. That night, under the bare bulb hanging in my workshop, the scale of the problem became clear. The connecting rod hadn't just broken, it had shattered, taking a fist-sized chunk out of the engine block with it. The crankshaft was scored, and the cylinder liner was toast. It wasn't a simple repair. It was a complete teardown and rebuild, assuming I could even find a new block. The next morning, I was on the phone with the John Deere dealer in town. The parts man, a weary old fella named Earl, sucked his teeth. "A block for a 4020? Oof, Jed, they haven't made those in years. I might be able to find you a used one from a salvage yard, but it's gonna cost you, and it'll take weeks to get here." Weeks. It was the first week of May. I had 150 acres of corn left to plant. Weeks meant disaster. "Just see what you can find, Earl, and get me a price on a rebuild kit. Piston, rings, liners, bearings, the whole works." For the next 3 days, while I waited for Earl's call, I tore that engine down to the bare frame. It was greasy, brutal work. I drained the coolant and the remaining oil. I pulled the radiator, the hood, the fuel tank. Using a chain hoist looped over a thick oak beam in the ceiling of the shop, I carefully lifted the heavy cylinder head off the block. Each bolt fought me, seized with years of heat and pressure. I barked my knuckles, tore a fingernail, and soaked 3 shirts in sweat and grime. But slowly, methodically, the heart of the machine was laid bare. Clay drove by my place every day on his way to his fields. I'd see his truck slow down, see him looking at the disemboweled tractor in my shop. He never stopped. He didn't have to. His message was clear enough. The community's verdict came swiftly. At the diner, where I went for coffee one morning just to get out of the shop, the silence was deafening when I walked in. Old man Hemmings, who'd known my father for 40 years, finally broke it. "Heard you had some trouble, Jed." "Through a rod," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. "Tough break," another farmer chimed in. "Planting season's no time for a breakdown." He paused, then added, "Clay Vance finished his corn yesterday." The words hung in the air. It was a statement of fact, but it felt like an epitaph. I was being left behind. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, happened to be there. He slid into the booth across from me, his face a mask of practiced concern. "Jedediah, this is exactly the kind of situation we can help with," he said in a low voice. "A new 4230, we could have it delivered to your farm tomorrow. More horsepower, a sound guard body for comfort. You'd be back in the field by noon." "And I'd have a $20,000 note hanging over my head," I said. "It's an investment in your future," he pressed. "You can't let one piece of bad luck ruin you. Let the bank take the risk." "It's never the bank's risk, Mr. Abernathy. It's always the farmer's. I'll fix what I've got." He sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "Your father was a practical man, Jed. He knew when to invest. This is just pride." He left and I sat there with my cold coffee, the eyes of every farmer in the room on me. They weren't just watching a man with a broken tractor. They were watching a man they believed was breaking himself on the altar of a principle they no longer understood. Earl called back that afternoon. He'd found a block at a salvage yard in Des Moines. It would cost me $800, plus shipping. The rebuild kit was another $500, $1,300. It was nearly all the cash I had on hand, but it was a fraction of the cost of a new tractor. "Get it here," I told him. It took a week for the parts to arrive, a week of watching my neighbors finish their planting, a week of seeing the first green shoots of their corn emerge from the soil while my fields lay black and empty. It was the longest week of my life. When the truck finally delivered the heavy crate containing the engine block, I felt a surge of hope. It was old and coated in grime, but it was solid. The rebuild was painstaking. I spent hours with a wire brush and solvent, cleaning every part until it gleamed. I honed the new cylinder liners myself, using a drill and a ball hone, checking the tolerances with a micrometer until they were perfect. I plastigauged the new bearings on the crankshaft, torquing the caps down, taking them off, and measuring the clearance to 1/1000th of an inch. It was slow, tedious, exacting work. Every night I'd fall into bed, my body aching, my hands smelling permanently of grease and steel, my mind churning with torque specifications and firing orders. Finally, the day came. The engine was reassembled. I used the chain hoist to lower the massive iron heart back into the tractor's frame, carefully aligning the splines on the clutch plate. I spent another full day reconnecting everything: the fuel lines, the radiator hoses, the wiring harness, the throttle linkage. My hands were raw, my back felt like it was going to break in two, but as I filled the radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with 30-weight oil, I felt a deep, primal satisfaction. I had not been defeated. I climbed onto the cracked seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter ground for a moment, then the engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. It wasn't just a sound, it was a resurrection. The smoke that billowed from the exhaust pipe was thick and white at first, then cleared to a healthy black puff. The engine settled into a smooth, powerful idle, deeper and stronger than before. I had done it. I was 3 weeks late, but I got my corn in the ground. It was a gamble. A late planting meant a risk of a wet fall or an early frost. But as I worked those fields, from sunup to sundown, I felt a quiet pride that no bank loan could ever buy. My 4020 ran better than it ever had, and I knew every single nut and bolt that held it together. That year, the weather held. We got a long, warm fall, and my late-planted corn had just enough time. My yields were down, but I had a crop. Clay Vance, on the other hand, had a bumper crop. His early start had paid off. The world was changing, and it seemed to be proving him right. Then came 1973. It started with whispers, then headlines. The Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, was buying American grain. Unprecedented amounts of it. The deal, brokered by the government, sent shockwaves through the market. Corn prices, which had been hovering around $1.25 a bushel, shot up to $2, then $3. Soybeans went from $3 to $6, then to $10. It was a gold rush. Every bushel of grain was suddenly worth 3 times what it had been a year before. For farmers, it was like winning the lottery. Especially for a man like Clay Vance. With his expanded acreage and top-of-the-line equipment, he was positioned perfectly. He brought in a massive harvest, and at these new stratospheric prices, the money poured in. He was the talk of the county, a bona fide genius. He paid off his 1066 in a single year, but he didn't stop there. He went right back to the bank, using his newfound success as leverage. He bought the Miller place outright, another 160 acres of prime land, at a price that would have been unthinkable just 2 years prior. Land values were skyrocketing along with grain prices. He traded in the 1066, which was barely 3 years old, for something nobody in our county had ever seen before. A brand new, 4-wheel drive, articulated Steiger Panther II. It was a monster, a true beast of the field, with dual wheels on all 4 corners and over 300 horsepower. It made my 4020 look like a garden tractor. The day it was delivered, half the farmers in the township drove by his place just to get a look at it. Clay was no longer just a farmer, he was a local celebrity. He built a new ranch-style house for his family, bought his wife a brand new Lincoln Continental, and was elected to the board at the co-op. He was the embodiment of the new American farmer, aggressive, leveraged, and wildly successful. I had a good year too. My modest harvest brought in more money than my father had ever seen in his life. But my reaction was different from Clay's. The first thing I did was walk into the Farmers National Bank and pay off the last of the old operating notes my father had taken out years ago. It was only a few $1,000s, but it was the last piece of paper that gave anyone else a claim to my farm. The teller, a young woman who didn't understand the significance, just stamped it, paid in full, and handed it back to me. I walked out of that bank feeling 10 feet tall. I was 32 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was completely and totally free of debt. With the rest of the money, I didn't buy land. I didn't buy new iron. I put a new steel roof on the main barn, something that had been needed for a decade. I replaced the worn-out tires on the 4020. And the rest, a substantial sum, I put into a simple passbook savings account, earning a modest 5% interest. To my neighbors, I looked like a fool. A coward even. Here was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to get rich, to expand, and I was tucking my money away in a savings account. Clay said it to my face one afternoon at the parts counter. "Heard you paid off your daddy's old notes, Jed," he said with a smirk, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bet that felt good. All $5,000 of it," he chuckled. My fuel bill was more than that last month. "Good for you, Clay," I said quietly. "Good for me?" he boomed. "It's good for America. We're feeding the world. A man's got to have vision. You're sitting on your hands while the biggest boom in history is happening. Scared money don't make money, Jedediah. You'll be a small-timer for the rest of your life." He walked out, leaving me in a store full of men who were nodding in agreement. They saw his new house, his new tractor, his confidence, and they saw me with my old tractor and my conservative ways, and they saw a man being left behind by history. That fall, as the golden wave of prosperity washed over the heartland, I sat at my kitchen table one night, balancing my ledger. It was a simple book, with black ink for income and red ink for expenses. The black column was longer than the red one for the first time in a long time. It was a good feeling. On the radio, a news program was playing quietly. The announcer's voice was grave. He spoke of runaway inflation, of the price of oil quadrupling, of a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve who was talking about drastic measures and taming inflation by raising interest rates. I turned the radio off and looked out the window into the dark. The air was getting cold, a hint of the winter to come. Across the section, a brilliant set of halogen lights cut through the blackness. It was Clay. He was out there with his new Steiger, chisel ploughing his corn stalks deep into the soil, working around the clock. The distant rumble of that massive diesel engine carried on the night air. It was a sound of immense power, the sound of progress and profit. But as I listened, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The rumble didn't sound like progress anymore. It sounded like a low, hungry growl, the sound of a beast that had to be fed, no matter the cost. The good years, the years of $3 corn and $10 beans, lasted just long enough for men to forget they had ever been poor. The memory of hardship faded like the paint on an old barn, and the new religion of leverage was preached from every bank and implement dealership in the Midwest. By 1979, the landscape had changed. The fields were bigger, the fence rows bulldozed out to make way for the giant, articulated tractors that now roamed the prairie. The sound of the heartland was no longer the steady thrum of a two-cylinder John Deere, but the high-pitched scream of a turbocharger gulping air. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was the slow, creeping silence of a rainless sky. The spring of '80 started dry and stayed that way. The corn came up thin and pale, the leaves curling in on themselves by midday to conserve what little moisture they could find. The ground, once soft and black, baked into a hard grey crust that cracked like old pottery. Dust became the new currency of the air, a fine, gritty film that coated everything and turned the sunsets into a bloody, ominous haze. Clay Vance's operation, now sprawling over nearly 1,000 acres, was particularly vulnerable. His massive machinery required massive fields to be efficient, and those big open fields were now defenseless against the hot, dry winds that blew relentlessly from the south. I'd see his Steiger Panther out there, pulling a 24-row cultivator, but it was just stirring up dust. The diesel engine, working hard in the heat, seemed to roar in frustration. I was cultivating my own corn one afternoon, the old 40-20 chugging along at a sensible pace, the steel shovels of my 6-row cultivator carefully scraping the weeds without throwing too much precious dirt. I saw the Steiger stop in the middle of Clay's field across the road. It just sat there for a long time, a giant green monument to stalled ambition. Then I saw a puff of black smoke, heard the engine try to turn over, and then silence. I finished my row and drove over. Clay was on the ground, staring at a massive puddle of hydraulic fluid spreading from beneath the articulated joint. His face, usually tanned and confident, was pale under a layer of dust. His hands, which I'd only ever seen clean or in new leather gloves, were black with grease and grime. He'd been trying to wrench on a fitting the size of a dinner plate. "Trouble?" I asked, shutting down the 40-20. He didn't look at me. He just kicked one of the giant dual tires. Main hydraulic pump went out, took the orbital motor for the steering with it. Can't move it, can't steer it, can't lift the cultivator. That's a tough break, I said, and I meant it. In the middle of the field, a machine that size was an anchor. Tough break? He spat, finally looking at me. His eyes were wild with a kind of panicked fury I'd never seen in him before. The dealer wants $12,000 to replace the pump and motor. $12,000. And they said it'll be 2 weeks to get the parts from Fargo. 2 weeks. The weeds are taking over, the corn's burning up, and I've got a $100,000 scarecrow sitting in the middle of my field. He gestured back at my 4020. I bet you could replace every moving part on that relic for half of that. Probably, I said quietly, but it wouldn't take 2 weeks. The parts for his Steiger did take 2 weeks, 2 weeks of perfect cultivating weather that he missed entirely. I saw the dealership's service truck out there, 2 mechanics in clean uniforms working for 2 full days to install the new components. The bill, I later heard, was closer to $15,000 when all was said and done. It was a crack in the gleaming facade of his empire. The first time people saw that the cost of modern farming wasn't just in the sticker price. It was in the complexity, the dependency, the crippling cost of a single failure. The dry summer gave way to a disappointing harvest. Yields were down by 1/3 across the county. The price, which everyone hoped would rise to compensate, did the opposite. An American grain embargo, a political move aimed at the Soviets, slammed the export markets shut. The bottom fell out of the prices. Corn was barely $2 a bushel, but the cost of fuel, fertilizer, and parts, driven by runaway inflation, had doubled. The math just didn't work anymore. The whispers started at the co-op. Men who had been bragging about their new combines a year earlier were now talking in hushed tones about their operating notes. The phrase variable interest rate became a curse word. Those were the loans men like Clay had taken out, tied to the prime lending rate. When money was cheap, they were a great deal. But Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve had declared war on inflation, and their only weapon was to make money expensive. The prime rate, which had been in the single digits for years, began to climb. 10%, 12, 15. It was like a slow tide of poison seeping into the soil. Every month, the interest payment on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt got bigger, while the value of the crop in the bin got smaller. The first foreclosure notice appeared in the paper in the fall of '81. The Hemmings farm, old man Hemmings' son, had taken over, bought a new tractor and a bigger planter on the bank's advice, and was now the first casualty. His auction was a grim affair. No one was there to find a bargain. They were there to pay their respects to a fallen neighbor and to wonder who would be next. By 1982, the prime rate hit 21%. It was a death sentence. The Farmers National Bank, the same institution that had pushed the loans and financed the expansion, now began to call them in. Mr. Abernathy, the friendly banker who had once bought coffee for everyone at the diner, was now a hollow-eyed man in a wrinkled suit who wouldn't make eye contact. He was just the messenger for the cold arithmetic coming down from the head office. Clay Vance held on longer than most. He was bigger, and he'd had more fat to burn. But his costs were bigger too. The fuel bill for that Steiger alone was more than my entire operating budget for a year. The payments on his land, his equipment, his new house. It was a cascade of obligations that could only be sustained by high yields and high prices. The reality was the exact opposite. I saw him one evening at the gas station, filling up 2 55-gallon drums in the back of his pickup. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in 2. His swagger was gone, replaced by a stoop in his shoulders, as if he were physically carrying the weight of his debt. "Jedediah," he said, his voice raspy. He was trying to make a joke, but it came out bitter. "Bet that little 4020 of yours sips the fuel, doesn't it?" "It gets by," I said. "Yeah." He stared off at the horizon. "I've got notes coming due." "Abernathy? He's not returning my calls." He shook his head, a look of disbelief on his face. "They told me to get big, or get out. They told me debt was a tool. They called it leverage. They never told me that lever could snap back and break you in half." 2 weeks later, the notice was in the paper. A public auction, ordered by the Farmers National Bank, to be held at the Vance farmstead. All machinery, equipment, and 960 acres of real estate to be sold to the highest bidder. My wife, Sarah, saw me reading it at the kitchen table. She put her hand on my shoulder. "It's a terrible thing," she said softly. "It is," I said. I folded the paper and put it aside. I'm going to the bank tomorrow. Jed, what are you going to do? I'm going to see how much is in that savings account. The day of the auction was cold for November, with a steel grey sky that threatened snow. The lane leading back to Clay's new ranch house was lined with pickup trucks for half a mile in either direction. The crowd was huge but quiet. They walked among the rows of machinery, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. It felt like a wake. The equipment, once a symbol of success, now looked like extravagant tombstones. The Steiger Panther II sat near the barn, a film of dust on its huge tires, the engine cold and silent. Clay was there, standing by the back door of his house with his wife and 2 young children. He looked thin, lost inside his own work coat. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on nothing, while Bill Hemphill, the same auctioneer who had sold him the 1066 all those years ago, began his chant. But today his voice lacked its usual fire. He was just doing a job, dismantling a man's life piece by piece. The small items went first. The tools, the air compressor, the grain augers. They sold for pennies on the dollar. Then came the tractors, the planters, the combine. Each sale was a blow, the sound of the auctioneer's gavel like a nail being hammered into a coffin. I stayed at the back of the crowd, just watching. Finally, Hemphill moved to the real estate. He started with the outlying parcels, the land Clay had bought during the boom years. Corporate buyers from Des Moines and Chicago, men in clean boots and wool coats, snapped them up. They weren't farmers, they were investors, and the land was just a number on a spreadsheet to them. With every parcel that sold to an out-of-towner, a collective sigh went through the crowd of local farmers. Then came the last parcel. Lot number 7, Hemphill called out, his voice cracking a little. The home quarter. 160 acres, more or less, with house, barns and grain storage. The original Vance family farmstead. A deep silence fell over the crowd. This was the heart of it all. This was the land Clay's father had farmed, the place he'd grown up. Hemphill started the bidding. It climbed quickly, driven by the men in the wool coats. The local farmers stood silent, their pockets turned inside out by the economy. The price passed what anyone thought was reasonable and kept going. It was about to be sold to a holding company from Omaha when I finally raised my hand. 180,000, I said, my voice clear and steady in the cold air. Every head turned. The man from Omaha, a slick-looking fellow with a clipboard, looked irritated. He conferred with his partner, then nodded to the auctioneer. 185, Hemphill called. I didn't hesitate. 190. I could feel Sarah's hand tighten on my arm. This was it. This was nearly everything we had saved. The man from Omaha shook his head and made a cutting motion across his throat. He was out. Hemphill looked around the crowd. $190,000. Do I hear 195? Going once? Going twice? He paused, his eyes finding mine. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Sold, for $190,000, to Mr. Jedediah Stone. The gavel fell. The sound echoed off the silent barn. A murmur went through the crowd, a mix of shock and relief. I walked forward to the clerk's table and wrote the check, the largest I had ever written in my life, draining the passbook savings account that Clay and the others had once mocked. As I was signing the papers, Clay approached me. His face was a blank mask, his eyes hollow. I braced myself for anger, for accusations. He just stood there for a moment, the wind whipping his hair. Why, Jed? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. To gloat? To finally prove you were right? I finished signing and turned to face him. I looked him square in the eye. No, Clay, this is good land. It shouldn't be owned by a bunch of numbers on a ledger in Omaha. It should be farmed. I held out a set of keys. They were for the old Farmall M. I'm going to need someone to look after this place. Keep an eye on things. Your family can stay in the house as long as you need. We can talk about renting the ground back to you next spring, on shares. 1/3 for me, 2/3 for you. We'll make it work. He stared at the keys in my hand, then at my face. He didn't understand. For a moment, his pride flared, and I saw him about to refuse. But then he looked over at his wife, who was crying silently, and at his 2 children huddled beside her. The anger in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a profound and terrible sadness, and then something else. A flicker of gratitude. He slowly reached out and took the keys. He didn't say thank you. He couldn't. He just nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin, and walked back to his family. That was more than enough. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis had culled the herd, washing away the speculators and the over-leveraged. Those who were left, the ones who had survived, were a different breed. They were more cautious, more resourceful. The talk at the co-op was no longer about horsepower and expansion, but about soil conservation and repair bills. Men started pulling old equipment out of the weeds at the back of their groves, machines they had forgotten how to fix. They started coming to me. "Jed, you know anything about the governor on an old M? Jed, my 403 combine is dropping grain. Any idea where to start?" I'd wipe my hands on a rag and walk over to their shop, and together we'd figure it out. My stubbornness, once seen as a foolish vice, was now regarded as a kind of folk wisdom. My old 4020, the museum piece, became a symbol of survival. Clay and his family stayed in the house. He farmed the home quarter for me, and we never signed a piece of paper. His handshake was his bond. He was a changed man, quieter, humbler, but a better farmer than he had ever been. He treated that land not as a commodity to be leveraged, but as a living thing to be nurtured. After 5 years, he had saved enough to make a down payment, and I sold the farm back to him for exactly what I had paid for it. One summer afternoon, years later, my own son, Daniel, was helping me in the shop. He was 16, with grease on his cheek and a growing curiosity about the world beyond our gravel road. We were doing an oil change on the 4020. "Dad," he said, tightening the drain plug, "why don't we ever get a new tractor? All my friends' dads have tractors with cabs and air conditioning and radios." I stopped pouring the fresh oil and looked at him. I pointed to the faded green hood of the John Deere. "You see that tractor?" I said. "Your grandpa bought it brand new. He paid for it with 3 years of good crops and hard work. And when he was done, it was his. This farm, this land, this tractor, it's ours. We don't owe a single man a single dime for any of it. There's 2 kinds of iron in this world, son. There's the iron that you own, and there's the iron that owns you. A cab and a radio are nice, but they aren't worth your freedom." He didn't fully understand, not then. But I knew he would someday. I climbed up onto the cracked and faded seat, the metal warm from the afternoon sun. I turned the key, and the old 6-cylinder engine rumbled to life with its familiar, comforting rhythm. It was the sound of my father's legacy and my own life's work, a sound of dependable, paid-for power. I put it in gear, the synchro-range transmission clunking into place with a solid mechanical certainty, and drove out of the shop into the sunlight. I looked out over my fields, the green rows of corn stretching toward the horizon under a wide and peaceful sky. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was the richest man in the county.